Today I'm speaking with Sarah Henn Hayward. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks.
Absolutely. I'm so glad we get a chance to meet and talk about your journey. Before we go into your story, I'm going to give a quick bio. It actually won't be too quick because there's quite a bit of things to say about you. So I'm going to read this off. Let me know if I get anything wrong, and then we'll let you clarify it and share about your hobbies. But Sarah grew up near Chicago, and now she lives in Spokane, Washington. She is a doctor of physical therapy. She writes commentary for Favs News, a religious news outlet based in Spokane, Washington. She and her husband have two small kids. She is a huge nature lover, and their family loves camping in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. She went to Marquette University, and she's also the author of several books. The one we're going to talk about for the most part today is called Giving Up God, Resurrecting a Spirituality of Love and Wonder, which is her memoir. She also has some kids' books called Kid Critter. It's a whole series. So please check out her work. The website and everything will be beneath this video, but it's sarahhennhayward.com. She shares her thoughts about life and gives some thought-provoking book recommendations. She's active on Instagram at @shaywardwrites. And she's also on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is just starting, but please let's go subscribe and jump up her subscriber count real quick. It's at Sarah Henn Hayward. Again, all the links beneath this video. Sarah, that's what I know about you so far, but before we get into your story, can you tell us more about yourself?
I consider myself a Midwestern expat, now living in the Pacific Northwest, and I love it out here. Spokane is a great little town. It's a small city, so it's got a lot of fun things to do, but then there's a lot of beautiful nature, a couple hours drive in every direction you go. And in fact, just this weekend, I'm heading up to Canada. Just a quick little weekend trip with some girlfriends. We're going to go. There's a town I had never even heard of before called Kelowna, British Columbia, and apparently it's the Napa Valley of Canada. So we're heading up there this weekend for a girls' weekend.
Very
But yeah,
cool.
we love to hit the road, and it's been nice. My kids are getting a little bit older now. They're just about to turn 6 and 8. And so they can handle some bigger road trips. So this year we've gone to the Redwoods. We've been to Glacier National Park. Last year we hit up Mount Rainier. So we're on a national park kick right now, which has been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. I'm jealous, very jealous of that.
Yeah.
That's very cool. That's what makes just so much fun with families, is getting the kids out there, getting nature and time together as a family. That's really cool. Well, we are here, of course, to hear your story, but I do want to get to your book eventually, but I'd love to just invite you, if you could, to take us back before we get into your book. Tell us kind of how you grew up. How did you get exposed to Christianity? And I'll just jump in with some questions.
Yeah, sure. So I was basically born into Christianity. My parents didn't grow up overly religious themselves. They were a little bit later in life converts. But when they got married, as they were engaged, my mom got converted through a friend of hers from college from Campus Crusade for Christ, which I later ended up joining full circle. And she was able to convince my dad to go to church with her. He eventually had his altar call experience. So by the time I was born, they were both new converts. So pretty into it, pretty committed and zealous. And they decided to raise us at an evangelical Christian church, the EV Free Church. And so I grew up going to Sunday school, being in Awanas, doing youth group. I was leading Bible studies, by 8th grade, and very, very committed and fully immersed in that Christian world. I would have definitely said that Jesus was my number one priority, identity, value, all of it. And so my faith was very defining for me. It felt like the foundation of who I was and who I was supposed to be. And in a way at the time that felt healthy. I felt like I had a good relationship with God. My church didn't seem to overly emphasize the original sin doctrine. I didn't really grow up thinking I was a complete piece of shit sinner. I don't know if we can swear.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so I really grew up thinking that the God of the universe knew my name, knew me personally, made me personally and intentionally, and loved me. And I believe that. So my faith honestly gave me a very strong sense of worth and value. And I had a pretty solid self-esteem. And I think a lot of that was because of my faith, which I know for some people it does the exact opposite, but I was lucky that way. And so, yeah, I was very, very into it my whole childhood. And all through college, I mentioned I joined Campus Crusade for Christ. First thing I did when I got to Marquette University, which was a Catholic Jesuit university. I did some retreats with their ministries, which was joining the Catholics felt a little sketchy. That was a first step away from my rigid, closed-minded thinking.
I was going to say
Um,
that is quite a jump from evangelicalism.
yeah, I was of the impression growing up that Catholics weren't really Christians, which the arrogance of that now. I'm like, oh my gosh, they were a church, but well before the evangelical church even existed. But they worshiped saints and they prayed to Mary. And so I thought they were all completely off base.
Right.
So that was neat being at Marquette and meeting some very faithful, devout people that took their faith very seriously as Catholics. That was a helpful step for me. So yeah, very, very still committed and devout in my faith through college, but starting to have some independence, some free thinking. I started allowing myself a little freedom. I drank in college and had kind of more the typical college experience in America with partying on the weekends and then studying hard all week. So I had a little fun, which now, especially looking back, I'm grateful I did. I was still on a fairly tight leash, but I let loose a little bit. But I ended up joining church ministry. I was on the leadership team for a young church that had been started in Milwaukee. And my faith became a lot more progressive and inclusive, but was still the number one thing in my life and my main kind of identifier. And so, yeah, that was my life up until my 30s. I met my husband. We both were very faithful Christians. We met online on a dating website. It was still a website back then, not an app. And what attracted me to him was in his bio, it said he led a small group with his church. And I thought, wow, he's real. He's a good one. So we
That's
got
the
married
criteria.
Yes. Not just a, Easter and Christmas Christian, but he led Bible study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now just go back a few steps. At what age would you say you officially understood the gospel and gave your life to Christ?
Well, of course, I prayed the prayer as a 3-year-old. So I'm sure that counts, right?
You beat me. I didn't get there till I think 5. So good job.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah, I was pretty young. And then I got baptized by my choice. Our church didn't do infant baptisms. It was a thing you could do anytime when you decided. I want to say I was 11 or 12, so still pretty young. I had an interesting experience recently at my current church, which we can talk about later. I still attend, where there was a little girl who decided to get baptized, and she was even younger. I think she might have been 8 or 9. And it kind of rattled me this time. She was a very sweet little thing, looked like the little cherub up there getting baptized. And I just thought, oh, what a baby. Like, to let a child make such a big decision, not that it really changes anything, but symbolically it's very important. Um, it was kind of creepy to watch, honestly, from the other side, because it felt very like she doesn't know what she's doing. This is all just handed to her. Felt a little brainwashy. Not that I love their family and she's a sweet girl and she has sweet parents, but yeah, it was weird being on the outside looking at that and thinking that was me. And I really believed it so wholeheartedly. And now I'm on a completely different page. So yeah, it's interesting being on the outside looking back in.
It is. It really is something else. And just for anyone that's watching that's used to my channel, and just heard you say the words that you still go to church, and they're basically saying, well, "What am I doing interviewing you?" We're not throwing you a curveball. We'll talk about that later. But
Yeah.
it's not what people think. Well, in terms of over the years, through your teenage years, did you feel like you were really growing in your private relationship with the Lord in terms of prayer and worship and seeking His will, and just that sense that He was, there in your heart and guiding you?
Yeah, I'm a firstborn rule follower, type A type of person. So I did all the right things. I did a near daily quiet time. I studied the Bible, memorized verses. I kept quite a few of them. I should start just throwing them away, but my old journal's just full of prayers and requests and analyses on my little biblical research. And so,
Wow.
yeah, I read the Bible cover to cover multiple times. I've read the New Testament many times over. So I made it personal, and I felt like it was very real and important to me. And I still felt that connection with God, that God knew me and loved me. And that lasted, yeah, throughout high school. I really kind of relied on that. It was a constant presence in the back of my mind that I was a Christian and that every decision I was supposed to make was supposed to be for the kingdom of God, that I was supposed to be dead to myself, living for Christ. That verse that says, you are now dead to self and alive in Christ, something of that nature. I wasn't supposed to be living for myself and my desires and my will. I was supposed to be trying to figure out what God wanted with me and with my life. And that kind of tortured me in a sense, because it was so nebulous, so unclear. What is God's will? How am I supposed to know that? I that's where I would beat myself up as a believer, not so much on my sinful nature and that I was such a horrible person all the time, but more on, am I doing enough? I know I'm saved. I know God loves me. But then there's that very disturbing passage about the sheep and the goats where Jesus says, get away from me. I never knew you. And they thought they were in. That one scared the shit out of me. And so I always wondered, am I a goat? Am I doing enough? Do I need to be selling all my things? Do I need to be witnessing on the street corner every day? What do I need to do? It felt like I needed to be more radical all the time. So I did have a sense of unease always of, well, I know I'm saved, but does God really approve of my life and is proud of what I'm doing? Am I going to get to heaven and hear that, well done, good and faithful servant? That was always kind of a low level stress in the back of my mind at all times.
Yeah, I can understand that very well too. It's amazing how that journey goes. And you do feel like, especially whether it's puberty with sexual desires or just anything that you feel like you're not really on fire for the Lord for, you do question, like, if I really had the Holy Spirit in me, wouldn't I be more convicted of sin? Wouldn't I be more willing to do anything I could to pray for the lost or to evangelize? And it really does. It puts you on that hamster wheel of like, I'm so proud that I'm doing the right thing and I'm giving my everything over to the Lord, but then I'm like, I'm so guilty and shameful. I'm just going to mention as a quick aside, I would suggest, just as a thought, to go back to those journals that you mentioned, because one of the things that's really interesting, I don't mean like soon, just whenever the time's right and you're not too triggered. I've kept like everything, all the Christian books, all my journals, and I know some people have said it's almost like a rite of passage to kind of get rid of them or burn them or something on the barbecue. Just do something to kind of say I'm done with that. But I found it very fascinating to go back to them and sort of try to identify what was the psychological manipulation and the religious trauma that I was going through, but also putting myself through. I was perpetuating it myself at a certain point. I mean, you're being indoctrinated as a child, but then eventually you are indoctrinating yourself and keeping it going. And it's fascinating to try to figure out what were those psychological dynamics that, as I like to say, that made me love my captor. Like, why did you think he was such a good guy when he was clearly a psychopath? And apart from the mythology part of it, just if he had been real, he was a nasty guy. But I loved him. I loved him so much. And it's interesting to try to figure out what makes someone tick that could do that and not see all the red flags everywhere. Anyway.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
So I was a psych major in college, so that approach of the psychology of it would be kind of fascinating to dig into.
Yeah, you could really pull it apart and find some great insights. Well, in terms of the journey that you took as you were going through, past the teenage years into young adulthood, what was your desire in terms of growing your ministry and obviously having a family that loved the Lord and kids that loved the Lord? Like, what was your expectation of the next few years before the deconstruction really hit hard?
Yeah, I wrestled a lot with what career path to choose because, of course, you feel like you're supposed to be a missionary, and so I thought about doing different things like that. And I did one international missions trip with my youth group, which now I look back and cringe on. But I ended up deciding to do a career in physical therapy. My parents actually kind of steered me that way because they thought healthcare was a safe bet and good job security and that sort of thing. So I thought, well, I can heal people. That's Christ-like, right? Christ was a healer. So I can have a normal job, a secular job, but make it ministry. And so that's kind of where I felt like everything had to be justified. You couldn't just pick a job because it was a good job. There had to be a Christ-like reason. And so that was my reason. But yeah, as meeting a husband and finding a family, even the fact that it had to be a husband, it didn't even occur to me that I could date outside of that one gender. Things like that were just so set in stone. You didn't even question. Now I wonder sometimes, I look back, is that how I would have explored some more? I don't know. I was so trapped in that heteronormative mold that is the one and only option of how to live your life. But I wanted to meet a Christ-like husband, and we would definitely raise our kids going to church. That was important. By the time I did meet my husband, we were both fairly progressive. He had also grown up really conservative Christian. He went to college, and actually he went to Western Washington in Bellingham here, which is very progressive and liberal as a community. But he will say the reason he sort of left the conservative side of things was because he took some econ classes that had conservative professors, and hearing them talk and seeing some of his friends talk, and the fact that they just seem to be so willing to completely ignore facts and science, that made him question, why am I on, this looks like the dumb side. I consider myself a smart man and an intellectual man, and these people are clearly ignoring what science is saying about climate or, things like that. And so he was fairly well progressive by the time we met. And so we didn't want to raise our kids to be little missionaries, and we didn't want to have that attitude of indoctrination where the only thing they knew was Christianity and they wouldn't even know how to talk to anyone else. And so even before I've had this big swing and deconverted, we were already reading them baby board books about Hinduism and Judaism and other religions, just to show, like, this is what we think, but there's a lot of other ways to think. And we don't know that we have a stranglehold on the one and only right way to live your life. And a lot of, millions of people around the world are different. And maybe that's okay too. We were both kind of in that all roads lead to Rome sense of eternity. And so I'm grateful for that, because I don't think that we ever did, hopefully, or aren't doing too much damage on our kids. Of course, we all screw up our kids to some degree, no matter what. But
no doubt.
yeah. But we had that attitude of, this is what we believe, but we believe it with open hands. We're not tightly gripping and clinging to this absolutely black and white, we're right, everyone else is wrong way of looking at the world. We had tried to embrace nuance and the gray zones early on. So, and the church that we go to, that we were going to as a family and still are, they have a similar approach. Their children's ministry motto for a long time was, I wonder. So they don't teach things as, this is what the Bible says, swallow it whole, don't ask questions. They think, well, I wonder what that would still look like today, or I wonder what it was like when they said that back then, and if things have changed, or even just for the really baby little kids, getting them into the sensory experience of the Bible. I wonder what it felt like to eat that bread that Jesus ripped up with his hands, or stuff like that. So I really respect and appreciate that approach, because they're not being heavy-handed about it. But yes, meeting a Christian husband, having a Christian family, all of that, of course, was number one, was very important.
So what were, as you were going through that and you're starting a family that, even though you're maybe liberal compared to where you were, you're still very much in this mindset that at least there's a few foundational things. I know that God is the creator, and that there's a, afterlife where we're going to have to give an account for our lives. And the cross is the pivotal part of history that saves us. Having at least that foundation still fairly intact. What were some of the things that moved it forward? And was there anything that was really pivotal, that, like, not just in terms of your thought process, but anything that actually, like, shook you up, or you're just like, wait, what the hell just happened? Like, this is different. What were some of those moments like?
Yeah, so some of it came for me during college. Marquette, being Jesuit, required, I was a liberal arts major with the psych degree. And so I had to take 3 semesters of theology class, which is a lot, a year and a half of theology. And so being in those classes and seeing how the Bible got put together and all those councils, and it all started to feel so man-made, learning that history. So that shook me up. That really kind of rattled me, especially around the Bible, to think there were other books that could have made it in that they chose to leave out. And I started looking at some of the Apocrypha and realized a lot of these stories are less patriarchal, and there's some women characters in here, and there's some more, and interesting that those didn't make the cut. And so I started holding on to the Bible a lot more loosely, thinking we need a whole lot of background information, a whole lot of context. So I was no longer a Bible literalist, thinking it was the exact words out of God's mouth, but thinking this was a human attempt to understand God. And they might have got a lot wrong. And it looks like they did. There's things in the Bible that we can see change from one book to the next in the Old Testament. And there's, contradictions and things. And so it was comforting, actually, because it made it easier for me to swallow that angry Old Testament God, to think, well, maybe God never wanted genocide. Maybe that was just the way of life at the time. And these were tribal people, and that's how they saw the world. And they said God wanted them to do that, but it was really just them. So it made it much easier to make excuses for God. And, you mentioned that cognitive dissonance. How could we love our captor? That's how, cognitive gymnastics. I would just say, well, that's not God. I don't think God really wanted any of that pain and evil and suffering, but we humans are screwed up, and that's what we do. and God's trying to steer us in the right direction as much as he can without being a complete puppet master and pulling our strings. Um, and so, yeah, becoming a more progressive Christian made it a lot easier to, as I say, liberalize God, and make God more palatable for a long time. So learning about the Bible was huge. Also, while I was at Marquette, I met my first openly gay friend. That was a massive rug ripped out from under me. Encountering him, he was even a believer. Um, and made me just do a little bit of investigatory work on what does the Bible actually say about this? Oh, it turns out nothing, because homosexuality didn't even exist as a word or a concept until the late 1800s. And I saw a really powerful documentary back then called For the Bible Tells Me So by Daniel Carslake. And it was targeted towards Christian parents who had a gay child. And so it was meant to be like, it's okay, Christians. Homosexuality can be allowed. It can be permitted by God. And so it went into some biblical history with the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and it went into some biology of how people are actually born this way and some theories as to how that works. And for me, it was a 180. It completely reversed my position. I became 100% affirming, thought people are born with the orientation they are. It's not a sinful choice. It's not a choice at all. And God made us. So if God had them born that way, it can't be wrong, is kind of how I started thinking of that. Um, and yeah, I think just kind of brick by brick, things started to come apart. Um, a little bit after that, I started to really question and doubt the existence of hell. So you mentioned the cross and that being eminent and so important. I don't know that I would have said that. We both my husband and I thought there's no way a God who says that they are love itself could have hell. That doesn't mesh.
Right.
That doesn't fit. It either doesn't exist at all, or it's more like the Catholics' purgatory, where it's a temporary way station until you're ready for heaven. Or I liked Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, about, all these different theories over time that have existed about eternity. And maybe everyone gets to heaven and you're refined in the refining fires of heaven, and you have to burn away all your sinful crap. And then now you're in heaven and it's all good.
So you were both kind of deconstructing together, even though you've landed at
That's it.
different spots. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to say we were on the same page our whole marriage until the last few years. And now we're not on the same page anymore, but we're definitely still in the same chapter, still on
Right.
the same book. Yeah.
It's a great way to put it. And obviously still in love and staying strong together. It's just, that's such a
Yeah.
good thing to hear. There's so many people for whom their story is obviously very, very dark and nightmarish, where
Mhm.
the issue of being unequally yoked is just an absolute
Yeah.
terror to the Christian
Hmm.
usually, and they just can't take it. So it's awesome to hear some success stories that it can happen. People can stay on the same page and they can grow together and respect each other even through the differences. It doesn't mean you have to land the same place, and that's really
Right.
cool. So what
That hasn't been easy. It's still been a rocky path, but
yeah,
yeah, we're doing it.
I'll bet. I do want to jump into that in a little bit as well, some more details. But and going
Mhm.
back just to the actual part of your journey, just you and your own thought process,
Mhm.
were there any called emotional challenges where you were thinking, gosh, I wonder if the devil's behind this and I'm being deceived, or I wonder if I
Mm.
just don't want to bow my knee to God? Maybe not even always things that we put in our heads, but just someone attacks us and says this stuff to us and pulls us
Right.
back to fundamentalism or whatever.
Yeah.
Were there some emotional challenges where you were, or just the fear even of like, wow, like how far I can see I'm on like a what we used to call a slippery slope. I'm
Right.
like, how far do I slip? Do I slip into, horror as atheism? And, but just what was that like internally?
Yeah. I will say, I think I'm protected by my nature is if you're into the Enneagram much, I'm an Enneagram 7. So we hate pain and suffering, and we want to just flip to the silver lining as fast as possible. So I'm very good at finding the bright side of things as quick as I can. Um, but yes, there was a ton of fear in the more recent years when I got to that pivot point of I don't think any of this is remotely real at all. That was terrifying. I felt such fear and anxiety and concern. My heart was pounding when I started to entertain that thought. I think for so much of my journey, I was able to deconstruct pretty safely because I was deconstructing Christianity. I was deconstructing the religion. That felt acceptable. I don't think I truly ever once asked if God could be real once until, within the last 5 years. I don't think my brain would even let me look at that question, maybe because it knew that the answer wasn't going to be what I wanted. Um, and so deconstructing Christianity felt even kind of like, I'm a free thinker, I'm hip and cool, and look at me asking questions. Getting to where I asked if God is real, that started to shake my husband up. He didn't like me saying that. That was scary for him. And it was scary for me to think, holy shit, I have based my entire life on this idea. If it's not real, then what the hell? Like, what have I done? So yeah, it felt very important and profound. And it felt like, if I do this, if I ask that question and answer it, no, I don't think so, who am I? I am a Christian to my core. That's who I'm supposed to be. So it was a huge identity crisis, really. And yeah, that was scary. That was intimidating. I can remember when I got to that point of asking myself that question, is God even real? Um, it was 2020. I had been laid off in the pandemic. Physical therapy took a big hit. I was at an outpatient clinic. Nobody wanted to go work out in a gym around other people. And I was part-time. We had kids already by then, so I've been working part-time. So I was axed early on in the pandemic. So I had a lot of free time to think. And my husband was working from home. Our kids were still napping. So when they napped, I would go on these big long walks. We have a park near the house, a nature park full of ponderosa pine trees. And it was springtime because it was like March or April that I got laid off. And so there was flowers blooming everywhere. And I'd go walk through the meadow and try to calm myself down as the world was burning around me. But I was on one of those walks that I got to that point where I said, God, could God be a human concept? Could God have been invented and created to answer our own cognitive stress, to give us a reason that life exists because chaos is uncomfortable? And I remember my heart pounding as I asked that. And I also remember then saying, no, I don't think they're out there. And the immediate sense of peace that I felt. It was terrifying to get there. It felt like in a horror film where the music is building and building and it's louder and louder and intense. And then it was just quiet. And I just felt a deep peace because it felt right. It felt like the right answer. I felt like I had arrived at intellectual honesty for the first time. And all that cognitive dissonance, that static just kind of blew away. So there was stress to follow the repercussions. But in that moment and making that decision was profoundly peaceful. And to me, that was a huge confirmation. Like, okay, I guess not. Guess they're not there. And no lightning bolt struck me down. So I didn't get immediately punished. So I guess maybe no one was paying attention. Maybe nobody was watching all along.
Hmm. That was amazing. I just, my heart leaps to hear people's stories of escaping. It really does. It's one of the most beautiful parts of, the honor to be able to hear people's stories through a platform like this. And I can definitely echo that with my journey. I was sitting at a computer on a Saturday morning, just thinking through it and saying kind of the same things, like, is it possible? Is it this? Could it be? And trying to come up with those objections, like, what about this? Could that many people be deceived for that long?
Mm-hmm.
All these ways in which we kind of pull ourselves back in. And eventually I was kind of saying to kind of talking to myself, and I could almost hear, like, the idea of like a drum beat that starts really low, I can almost barely hear it, and then it gets just louder and louder. It was
Mm-hmm.
almost like this drum beat saying, as if the other voice inside was saying, Tim, say it, say the words, it's not real. And you just
Mm-hmm.
gotta say it, say it, say it, it's not real. And it's eventually just like, it's not real. And as soon as I said it, I was like, that makes so much more sense of my life and my experience
Mm-hmm.
than anything I've ever experienced in Christianity. That, like,
Yeah.
all these questions, like the reason that this puzzle piece won't fit in that niche is it's not meant to, it's not going to fit. It doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we're looking for all these answers and feeling like we don't get them, or the ones that we get are they just don't feel right, and they don't feel like they're more like a gloss over. Like, that's the reason it doesn't work, is it doesn't work. And it's like, I felt like I won the lottery. I was like, and of course,
Yeah.
like you said, the aftermath was on your brain real quick, like, what just happened and how
Oh
does this
shit.
affect the rest of my life? But at the
Yeah.
same time, it's like, my immediate thought, I almost started laughing. Literally, I was laughing in my head,
Mm.
thinking I could have gone to my deathbed thinking, it was all real. And
Yeah.
I've now got hopefully some time to redeem and actually live my real life.
Mm.
Now, with yours, in your book, you mentioned a whole range of emotions, some of them ranging from peace, like we were talking about here, but also to
Mhm.
rage. What was that rage part of it like?
Mm. Yeah, that idea that I've been duped, just feeling like a fool to some extent. And yeah, how did this happen? How could so many people, like you said, throughout time we've all been believing this? Um, and just, yeah, thinking about how many decisions could have been different, thinking about all the money I gave to church over the years, like so many ways that it really controlled my life, um, was a bit overwhelming to look back and think, was that all for nothing? But I do give myself and current believers a lot of grace, because there are reasons that we all thought that for so long and that so many people do. Culture is huge, and our human need for meaning and our human drive to see order in chaos is profound, is strong. And so I give ourselves a lot of mercy and grace in that, because we weren't fools and we weren't, being dumb and being tricked. It was, I don't know, it's in the air we breathe. It's in the zeitgeist that people believe in a higher being. And there are reasons for that, especially speaking psychologically. There's cognitive biases that make us see what we want to see. And it's comforting to think someone's in charge, even if that person might send you or someone to hell. Just thinking someone's in charge. It's why people fall for conspiracy theories and cults. It's comforting to think somebody's calling the shots. Chaos, a completely unconcerned universe, is uncomfortable to think no one cares about my life. No one's watching. It doesn't matter what I do. That is not a happy thought for many people. It can be freeing, and I have found some freedom in it, but I think it's scary. And so that I think there's very obvious reasons. And since making that choice, I've read a lot of books on kind of the anthropology of religion and the cultural background of it, and to see how it served a very important role, honestly, probably in the survival of our species. And it's been beneficial in many degrees. I have a kernel of an idea brewing in my mind for another book, or at least an article from my paper, about how religion has served an important purpose and we seem to be evolving out of that. And it's no longer serving us. It's clearly hurting the planet now in more ways. So many wars and violence done in the name of God. So maybe it's time we need to outgrow it as a culture. But yeah, I do try to look back and give myself and people who are still in the faith, which is a lot of my friends and family, give them a lot of grace, and not, I don't want to look down on people who still believe, because I was in it until very recently and for legitimate reasons. And I don't know, religion can serve a healthy purpose. So if it is actually just making someone's life better and at peace, great. I wouldn't try to rip that away from them, honestly. If it's
Yeah.
toxic and they're using it to hurt and harm others, well, then yeah, knock it off. But for a lot of people, religion is a good guiding principle and a good guiding force. So I try to
Yeah.
hold on to both of those.
I think and I want to go back to what you were saying and ask you a question, but just to make a quick comment on what you just said, I think the hard part for me is finding that balance of
Mhm.
trying to say, all of you collectively and individually, you can all believe what you want. We're all free. That's the point of escaping, is not just escaping Christianity, but escaping fundamentalism.
Mhm.
It's your path. Your thought autonomy is critical. But the thing that just really I struggle with so much is the idea that so many Christians are willing to indoctrinate their children with such toxic mentalities that you're
Mhm.
basically saying, you're kind of saying it in two things in one breath. You're saying you're free to believe what you want, but you're also free to psychologically abuse your child. Like,
Mhm.
no, I'll say the first part, but not the second. But the thing is, they take both together. And that's
Yeah,
hard. That's really hard for me to think through. But
sure. Yeah. And I think I hate to, be the devil's advocate here, the God's advocate, but just say not all Christians, like there are
yeah,
folks like the people at my church who are not doing that to the kids, or not indoctrinating them and thinking it's our way or the highway and you're going to go to hell if you don't believe this. I don't think hell has been said one time since I've been at that church. That is not a thing that they emphasize or talk about at all.
no,
I know my pastor personally. He and I met up a lot in the course of me getting to the point of leaving. He's read my book. He's promoted it. He's the one who set me up with this other author gig for the news. Um, and he has had many of the same thoughts, and that comes through in his sermons. He's not super dogmatic and clinging tightly to these exclusive beliefs. So there
Yeah.
are Christians out there who can, I think, be healthy about it, but maybe that's few and far between.
Yeah, and we all interpret our journeys through what we've been through, and I've been through much more fundamentalist, extremist versions, and I'm sure if I had a different journey, it would feel differently. In terms of going back to what you were talking about a few minutes ago, you were kind of getting close to the topic of nihilism. It wasn't on my mind, but I thought it was a great point to make. How do you deal with that sense of like, I know I can make my purpose, but compared to the purpose that was kind of put on a silver platter for me and handed to me, and it was so clear as to, you're either in the club or you're not, and you're serving him or you're not, you're bringing, people to the kingdom or you're not. And now it's like, if you want to choose to write a book to help people, that's fine. If you want to choose to do, this career to help people, but if you also want to spend your days in a garden by yourself and not talking to people, or you want to spend your whole life watching football, like it kind of doesn't matter in one sense. And for a lot of Christians who are on that deconversion, deconstruction process, that is, I think, one of the scariest things, both the terror of like, what if I don't go anywhere when I die? But also sort of right on the heels of that is like, what if there's not really a purpose? And therefore, what if, if you could look, for example, in the future, 1,000 years or, 10,000 years, or even, 100,000 million years, if you could look back, the people that live, if there's still people around, then they're not going to look back and think, wow, you made such a big difference. I mean, maybe there's some, 2 or 3 people, in history that'll be such a big deal that people 100,000 years will still look back and talk about them. But by and large, almost everybody on the planet right now, in 100,000 years, no one will even care or know in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of people, even after us, they'll be in the same boat. And it begins to feel a little bit depressing and a little bit like, gosh, I know it's like someone writing you a bad check for $1 million. It's like, I know that now that I know that check was never going to clear, it's not really a loss because you didn't really have it, but for a long time it felt like I did. And it's like, oh, that it feels like a loss. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I'm that sunny optimist, so I'm going to find the silver lining as quick as I can. And that thread of nihilism, I definitely felt to think, yeah, I thought that there was eternity. I thought somebody was watching. I thought I would get credit for living a good life and have some kind of payoff. And slash just having the purpose of God ordering my decisions and ordering my thoughts that gave my life some order. And so not having that, it did feel meaningless for a couple minutes, for a little bit, as I considered, what now? If God is not real, then I have to relook at everything, morality, purpose in life, all of it. And a book actually helped me out through that quite a bit. It's a really heady science book by a physicist, but it's called The Big Picture by Sean Carroll, that I read right as I was at that pivotal point. And he talks about a theory called poetic naturalism, which I liked a lot. So naturalism, kind of that completely secular worldview that the physical world is all there is. There's no spiritual realm, no ghosts, no spirits, no angels, no demons. What we have is matter in the universe, and there's still plenty of mystery there, but we can measure and see what we can measure and see, and that's all there is. And in one sense, that can be very nihilistic, thinking there's no big guy in charge. There is no purpose, that evolution just does its thing, irregardless of our feelings or our desires or anything, that life is just going to roll on through no matter what. And nobody cares, like you said, in just a matter of a few generations, nobody will even know that you and I ever existed. And yet, as humans, we have evolved consciousness, we have evolved morality, we have evolved the idea of meaning and how to create meaning from chaos. And so the way I see it now, I'll say on an eternal cosmic level, there's no meaning. Nobody's ever going to know I was around. I'm here for not even a blink of an eye. But I am here right now, and my life matters because there are people in my life who I matter to and who matter to me. The here and now is all I'm guaranteed. I don't know what, if anything, comes next. I don't know how long I'll have on this world. I don't know where I was before I was born, if I did not exist, or if I just came into being the moment my cells divided enough. It's all still such a mystery, but I am here now. I know that, unless this is all a simulation and then none of it's even real at all. Um, And so my life matters right now because I'm here, kind of like ipso, like just because I am here, therefore it matters. I have a family, I have friends, I have people that my decisions impact and that make a difference. And it might be a small sphere of influence, but I matter to that sphere. Do I matter to anybody right now living in Denmark or Ghana or India? No. And I won't, most likely, at all. But I matter to my little circle of influence. And that is something. I think that counts. And so it made me think it was kind of, to me, that meaninglessness has a freeing aspect because, okay, the pressure's off. It doesn't matter what I do with my life. I can sit in the backyard and watch butterflies all day, or I can dedicate myself to social justice and try to make a measurable impact on my community. Anything's allowed. That's freeing. And then to think, yeah, that I can do what I want and define meaning for myself, and that is real, that counts because I have deemed it so, kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good way to put it.
Mhm.
It's I love the way you put that, and it's to step back to, and that's the word, the partial word poet in there.
Mhm.
It's amazing how much this journey of deconstruction and deconversion ends up making a lot of us either literally into poets, or at least feeling like there's a
Mhm.
poetic part of us that's coming out that's never been there. Part of it from the religious trauma and the healing and the pain and
Mhm.
reclaiming our identities, but also just realizing that that our whole worldview is shifting. We're seeing the universe and ourselves in such different ways, and we're
Mhm.
hitting the reset button. And it's, in some ways, it's staggeringly overwhelming. It's like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, like I've never lived a day in my life before, and it's just
Mhm.
you just feel like I don't know where to start. But yeah, obviously you take baby steps, and eventually you find your way.
Mhm.
But it is interesting how much it makes people have that poetic part of them come out. And it's
Mhm.
there's a verse in the Bible that says, out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. And I feel
Mhm.
like that's very applicable to these situations where just our hearts, our minds become just so overflowing with like
Yeah.
what has happened and where do I go from here. Now, two of the words that came up in your book that were pretty important, I wanted to ask you just to kind of explain the concepts and how these evolved in your process: vulnerability and community. What did those mean to you?
Mm. Yeah, vulnerability is just as a concept, something I really gleaned from Brene Brown. I love her and I've read all of her books, and she's spent her life researching vulnerability and shame. And so as I wrestled with, well, what do I want to do with this life that is now mine to live myself? Where do I get meaning from? My definition of being the best human I can be and living the best life I can be is being authentic and real to myself. And that involves being vulnerable. There's a lot of pressure to follow trends, whether that is in fashion and appearances, but even thought trends and what's in the zeitgeist right now and what's important, what's happening. And I think the vulnerability of thinking differently and being able to own that, that's hard to do. That's scary. You don't know how people are going to receive what you're going to say. Now, my main kind of, I would say politics has kind of replaced religion in a lot of ways for me, or just that social awareness. And so trying to not just completely lockstep with my progressive party views, but just to stay free thinking and to be willing to have opinions that are different. That's can be scary. The vulnerability to just be my own wacky weirdo self and not worry about being judged by friends. That has become important to me, and it's a challenge, I think. But to me, that's how you live a real life. You be yourself, even if it's not cool or it's not hip at the time or whatever. So I've really been impressed and motivated by Brene's work on vulnerability. And then within that community, so there's tons of research that shows that living in community is good for us. It's healthy. People who have bigger social networks live longer. I was just reminded of a fact I heard yesterday that it's more dangerous to have no friends than it is to be a heavy smoker, that it would be better for your health to be a smoker with friends than to never touch a cigarette but be lonely. That's huge. That's insane. When I was in PT
Mm.
school, smoking came up in every single class I took as being a negative factor for every single facet of our body. So to think that truly health markers would be better off to be a smoker with friends, that blew my mind. And so just that importance on community. I also picked a lot of that up from learning more about evolution. Growing up Christian, I did not believe in evolution. I would cover my ears when it came up in my public high school. That was Satan's work. I didn't think it was real. And so as an adult, I've learned a lot more about evolution and specifically the human path of evolution. And looking at our tiny little, quite frankly, pathetic species, we don't have big claws. We're not super fast. We don't have a thick armor. We're not poisonous to be eaten. We don't have a whole lot going for us except the fact that we have big enough brains that let us work together and strategize as a group. We hunted as groups. We had plans. We could outthink other creatures in order to eat. That working together was pivotal to our survival. It is literally what makes us human is community and that reliance on each other. Being again a PT and knowing about the human body, being a creature that walks on 2 feet has advantages, but a major disadvantage is pregnancy and birth. It's a lot more dangerous to give birth to bipedal creatures like ourselves than to creatures that are on all 4 arms and legs. And so from the very, very beginning, we needed midwives. It was probably one of the first jobs or roles that there was because giving birth is inherently dangerous for our species. We needed people there to help and turn the baby or do things. So we were completely reliant on each other. And even the fact that after birth, our babies are born extremely vulnerable. Now we consider the first 3 months of life the 4th trimester where they're completely helpless. And the new mother would have needed either someone to hold her baby to go hunt and get food or someone to bring food to her while she breastfed and cared for her young. We absolutely need each other. And so just thinking about how ingrained community is to our species, to me, I thought, well, we should keep that up. That's how we got here. It's how we've survived. That seems important. And so I feel very lucky that my community didn't completely abandon me when I left the faith and left belief in God. Most of my friends were of the progressive Christian camp, so they were able to roll with it when I said I was out. And I have other friends who aren't believers at all, and they were probably cheering for me to finally get there, like you said. But yeah, I've been able to keep some really, really good friends in my life and have those people that I can call when shit goes sideways and I need help or just to have fun with and enjoy life. My girlfriends, I'm going up to wine country this weekend. Like that's the reason to live in my mind. Wine and friends. No.
Not necessarily in that order. It's interesting to me how the idea of skin to skin contact, both for babies and also thinking about older people in a nursing home, it just that is so pivotal to not just have people that you can see, but people you can touch. Like that makes such a difference. And just thinking about those stories you hear of the orphanages where there's nowhere near enough people to care for the babies, and the babies literally I've heard stories where you can go into an orphanage where there's babies and or like a nursery of some sort, and there's no crying like you'd expect, and the babies just learn that no one's coming to help them, and it's just as someone that's I've got 4 little beautiful children, and just like your heart aches for that. I did want to ask, in the book you identify with the term Christian atheist. What does that mean, and how does that all reconcile together?
Yeah, I wrestled with a couple labels. So I, of course, got into therapy when I made this monumental life change. And my therapist at the time really encouraged me to find a new way to identify because she said, people are going to immediately ask you if you say you're not a Christian anymore, well, then what are you? And so instead of having a huge, long, convoluted answer, it's going to be helpful to have something kind of quick go to just appease them because they're probably not all that curious anyways. But and so I wrestled with a few labels, Christian atheist being one of them. And I liked it because I liked how it was upsetting and a little bit of a, curveball to throw people. And to me, it emphasizes that Christianity is such a cultural thing, which I think it really is more than anything. And culturally, I am a Christian. I always will be. I grew up in that world, drinking that water for the first 3 decades of my life. And so I will never not be a Christian. It's part of my story. It's part of who I am. It's part of my history. And I still am that 3-year-old little girl praying the prayer. I still am that earnest believer reading the Bible over and over. That will always be who I am and in my story, even as I've evolved out of it. And so I am a Christian, I think, in my DNA. And at the
Mm.
same time, I don't believe in God. So I'm an atheist. So I think I am a Christian atheist. I stand by that. I don't think, obviously doctrinally, no Christian would agree that I'm a Christian, but it is part of who I am. And so I
Yeah.
kind of like that label just to be troublesome.
Yeah, I would take it a different direction for my life. In one sense, I'm much more comfortable with just a pure atheist. But I see where you're coming from. But the one area where I would definitely say that I crisscross with that is Christmas. It's just
Mm.
I feel so bad for atheists that I come across who are just like, I hate Christmas. I can't believe it's still a thing. I'm like,
Mm.
I get it. I understand. But you know what? Focus on the twinkly lights, focus on the presents, focus on
Yeah.
the songs that are not necessarily that deep theologically, or even just the tune. But I know it's an issue too. It's triggering for a lot of people. They're just like, I want to
Yeah.
be done. I want to be done with that. And
Sure.
my heart aches for that. But
You
I've
can't escape it in the US. Christmas
yeah,
is such a, again, cultural thing.
yeah,
What's helped me there specifically is learning more about the pagan roots of Christmas and all of the
yeah,
holidays, really. And to think of it again in terms of that human story. And Christmas, so many pieces of it are pagan and are way older than Christianity. And to think this is part of our human desire to make meaning and to make beauty. It's such a, to me, symbolic obvious thing of bringing light into the darkness. You're going into winter, you light up the house with twinkly lights, everything's dying outside, you bring a tree inside the house. Like there's a lot of beautiful symbolism there that you can divorce from the religion if you are so inclined or want to try. But yeah, for
yeah.
me, tagging some of those pagan bits to it has been kind of fun and freeing in that way.
Yeah, and I think too, just want to because I'm so consumed sort of with thinking through the astrotheology that's woven into the Bible, just thinking through how the earlier cultures were so in tune with the equinoxes and the solstices and just
Hmm.
the movements of the seasons and the stars. And a lot of this was arguably, in my opinion, star stories. They literally like made up stories in the stars, what they
Mm.
saw, and then put them into stories in writing. But regardless of all that, it's like it kind of makes you think from the pagan perspective, like you're kind of connecting yourself to the planet a little bit more with the seasons and also to our ancestors
Hmm.
to say we're kind
Yeah.
of celebrating the fact that hey we got here, it was a rough journey
Hmm.
and they got us here, and
Hmm.
hopefully like we've obviously progressed from them, but hopefully we can keep passing the baton and progress from here.
Yeah.
um, I do want to ask you, in the book you mentioned sort of various interpretations of God and the divine. You mentioned, if I got this right, God as being itself, or God as an event, God as a super being. How do these ideas resonate with you, and how do you find sort of the value of the idea that God is a process or some kind of force for love and freedom and all that?
Yeah, I was starting to explore some of that. So my brother-in-law, one of my brother-in-laws is a pastor. And he's I'm gonna forget which, he'll kill me if I say the wrong one. He's UCC. I'm not sure. It's a very progressive brand of faith. He's openly gay and he's a pastor, so it's a group that's okay with that. And he tried to help bring me to show me that, he often laments that I grew up evangelical. I said, if you had grown up mainline and had been an Episcopal all your life, you would still believe in God, because he says a lot of the Episcopals and certain types of Christianity have been more than okay with all these questions and mysteries. And it is, I think, a very evangelical story, the whole deconstruction journey.
Yeah.
So he gave me some process theology books, which honestly, at this point, I'm not that interested. I might pick them up later. It's felt so simple and freeing to just be like, done, I'm out. So I haven't spent a ton of time really digging into that, but I do think there could be. I'm still interested in thinking about our our drive for spiritual meaning or that higher purpose. And there was a podcast that Rob Bell did, and they were talking about, I think it was Paul Tillich is a theologian, and he had these three ideas that God is, people think of God as either a super being, which is, I think, what I grew up, that basically God is everything that a human is, but more. So God is a person that we talk to with pronouns. And if people are finite, God is infinite. If people's knowledge is limited, God is all knowing, that kind of thing. But they said there's other ways of thinking of God, and you couldn't think of God as a event. And that one kind of hit me the most. Of God isn't a being, God isn't a person, but God is what happens when we have community, when we reach out to each other, when we show love, mercy, compassion. That act creates God in that moment. It sounds very, to me, heady and intellectual and kind of like, okay, let's leave that to the scholars, maybe, as far as our day-to-day real world does that even matter? But I like that concept that God is maybe not a being at all, because I don't think that there's a person up there watching, but that God is just maybe our better nature, that when humans' better nature wins and we are selfless and generous and caring, that creates God, whatever that means, So
Yeah.
if any theologies still appeal to me, that would be it. But then I kind of step back to and think, why? That just seems to be muddying the picture and making it cloudy for no reason. So
I love
I don't go by Christian atheist just on a daily basis. I say I'm atheist, or agnostic atheist is usually what I tell people. But
right.
yeah, it just muddies the waters too much.
I love how you sort of said like your default is just to say just whatever else is the discussion. I'm out.
Yeah.
And it made me think of that song. That's that classic by Kenny Rogers, The Gambler. He's got that phrase talking about your cards, playing poker, and he says you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to walk away, and know when to run. And it's like part of us is just like I fold and I'm walking away, I'm running away, I'm done.
Yeah.
In terms of again, going back to some of the topics that you dive into in your book, you do talk about the dangers of isolationism. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but also independence and the self-made myth. So I guess my question might be, how do you think we can foster like a better sense of community that you already started talking about, but also that interconnectedness with this, issue of the self-made myth?
Yeah, I think that's most likely a pretty American worldview. I don't know that other countries are so individualistic as we are. We have that pull you up by your bootstraps mentality. And I think just a little bit of education on history shows that it's a complete lie that no human has individually alone pulled themselves up by anything, that we always have a network and people helping us. There's always someone who has either paved the way or is helping support you along the way. And so being a student, I think, and a lifelong learner, to me really opened my eyes to some of that interconnectedness that we truly have. I think it was Martin Luther King that I read a quote, or someone was saying, think about just your morning cup of coffee. The first thing in the morning, you make that coffee, you're going to take a drink. Where did the coffee beans grow and who grew them? Who picked them? Who put them in a truck? Who got them to the factory, cleaned them up, roasted them, ground them, flew them to you? There was a pilot involved. Somebody else unloaded them off the plane. Somebody else put them into a marketing factory and slapped the label on the can. There was probably hundreds of hands who touched your coffee before you got to it, not to mention the cup you're drinking out of. Somebody made that. Somebody painted that. Somebody made the paint that went on the mug. It's just an immediate web when you start to think of any one item. Our cell phones, anything we touch has been created by an army of people, that truly nothing we do is alone. Even the person in Spokane, we have a lot of folks around here who like to live off the grid. We're kind of adjacent to very white supremacist areas, and folks that don't trust the government and want to live on the mountain and have their own generators and do their own thing. Even still, there's a road that got to their house. They didn't build the road. Society is so interconnected. The generator was made. They got to get gas. They're not mining their own gas. I don't even know how that works. I think about my clothes that I buy. I don't know how to grow cotton and turn it into fiber and dye it and make a shirt. Like everything I do, I rely on other people to have done it for me, and then I can pay for it. And so just from that perspective, thinking that we are interconnected, even if I'll never know those people's names, so many humans enable my life to exist and for me to live. I'm not growing my own food. I go to the grocery store, like I rely on other people to feed me. And so thinking of it that way, to me, and just learning about how things work, how the world works, how industry works, that just to me is an object lesson in the fact that we need each other and we're depending on each other, probably now more than ever, because I wouldn't even have a clue how to start living off the grid independently anymore. I think our ancestors far back enough had a better shot. And even then they relied heavily on each other. So yeah, the self-made man to me is a complete phony idea. And it just inflates whoever's claiming that's ego. I did it all by myself with no help. You look at, I don't know if you want to get totally political, but you look at someone like a Trump, he thinks he's this big shot businessman. Well, his daddy gave him millions of dollars in an early loan to get him going. Like, you didn't do it yourself, man. So yeah, to me, it's a dangerous myth because it does put you on this better than everybody else pedestal. And it's not living into that humility, that vulnerability of actually, I'm pretty helpless on my own and I need a lot of people just to function. So that's where
Yeah.
that vulnerability comes back into. Yeah.
Going back for a minute to your story with your family, could you talk again about the differences between you and your husband in terms of, like, I guess first start with what was his initial reaction? You touched on it a little bit, but could you dig in more? Like, what were those initial conversations like in the first few weeks and months when you were like clearly diverging on the basic question? I mean, it's kind of the big question out there is God even there? And for you to say, no, I don't see the evidence that he's there. And for your husband to say, yes, I think so. Like, how those conversations go? How did you work through the differences? And maybe when you're done telling that part of the story, if you could maybe also weave in some advice for people, because there's a lot of people going through it and trying to walk on eggshells and tiptoe and feeling very, very wounded already, just knowing that when they talk about it, so many things are going to be at stake, and it's for a lot of people, they already can see it's going to hit the fan hard, and they're already kind of counting their losses. It's interesting how the Bible says that those verses in the Gospels where Jesus says, don't go out to war unless you first count the cost if you can win the war, and don't build a house unless you can count the cost that you can actually fulfill it, as opposed to just putting down a foundation, then you're out of money, you can't build the rest of it. So he says, count the cost to follow me. And it's like a lot of us are counting the cost of what it means to unfollow Jesus. What was that process like for y'all?
Yeah. So again, when I got to that point, it was the pandemic. So we were living in the twilight zone. Nothing felt real. Time didn't exist. We were never leaving our houses. It was a very disorienting just time, I think, for the planet as a whole and us included. And so when I told him, I think, well, he later told me he thought, oh, this is just a phase. She's been laid off. The world's a mess. She just, everything looks bleak. I was really shooken up by George Floyd's murder, as were many of us, thinking how evil the world is. He's like, she's just, upset about how racism and evil is still so present in our lives. It's making her feel down, and God doesn't exist, but she'll be back, is kind of what he thought for a long time. So he kind of lived in a chosen denial. And then I just didn't bring it up a whole ton more. We just kind of let it sit there. We had young kids, so we weren't sitting around talking theology a lot of the time anyway. And then we weren't going to church either, because again, it was the pandemic. There was no church. Our church took the pandemic seriously, so we didn't meet in person until vaccines were out and it was fully safe and allowed. And so then when that happened and we were going back to church, there was a week that our church doesn't do communion every week, but they had communion. And my husband went to get up and I said, I'm not going to get up and go with you. This means something very specific and important, and I don't believe in what it's saying. And that was the dagger in his heart of like, oh my gosh, she does not believe in God anymore. That's when it hit him. And he had a near panic attack. His whole body erupted. He started getting all these symptoms, tingling and all kinds of ringing in his ears. His body freaked out. And so I felt horrible. I set him on what is still going on, years long path of medical questions. And is it just stress? Is there something else? It really shook him up, and I felt completely responsible for it, which I felt terrible. But on the flip side, I said, you don't want me to lie to you and to pretend to be in something I'm not and just to put on a show. I've always believed strongly in authenticity and being myself. And so I'm not going to lie to my husband. And he didn't want me to lie to him. He just would have liked that. That's not where I was at, but it was where I was at. So it was hard. We got into some couples therapy. We actually met with my pastor and his wife, because again, they're pretty open-minded, and they did not throw me under the bus. If anything, it felt like they kind of not took my side, but were supportive of me and like, listen, people are married who are on different pages. You're not the first couple to be there. There are people that are a Jew and a Christian who are married, or a Muslim and a Jew, like those couples exist. We put so much importance on things, but sometimes we can be pretty narrow-minded to realize that there's always been other people living outside of what we think was the right way to do it. So they pointed out some couples in our church who were unequally yoked, as you could say, or or one who was a Democrat and a conservative, which again, in the Trump era is a real tough place to be. And so they kind of steered us in that direction to say, like, you can make this work, and here's some ways to help you do that. And I think we kind of took a step back and said, yes, it's true that both of us would have not married each other had we not been Christians at the time. Like, I required, that was a non-negotiable deal breaker, that my spouse had to be a Christian, and same for him. But that's not the reason we got married. You knew other single Christian women before me, and you didn't just grab them off the street. Like, you still chose me for other reasons. That was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it was not the whole puzzle. So kind of stepping backward and seeing that we were not together solely because of our faith. So what are the other reasons we're together? You know, we still respected each other, the way we parent, and our politics and our other views on things in the world, because we line up very similarly in every other way. So kind of leaning on that. I think we did a lot of dancing back and forth. So we'd kind of engage with it and talk and have these really hard, heavy talks, and then step away for a few months and try to just live our lives and have fun and enjoy the kids. And so we didn't hammer it home constantly, you know, or just beat a dead horse. We took a lot of breaks and stepped back, which I think was helpful and important. And then did try to touch base every so often. I think it helps if you actually like each other, which we do. We get along and we're friends. And so with that, we believe the best in each other. He knows I'm not trying to hurt him, that I didn't try to, you know, destroy his health and put his life in a tailspin. I know he still cares about me, even though he is upset. And there's been times he's gotten flat out angry at me, and I've just let him, you know, allowed that to be. He's processing and feeling his thing. So I try not to rise to the bait every time he says something I don't totally love, but just let him kind of feel his feels and be there without jumping on every little flight or whatever. Touching base later. I don't advocate letting anybody be verbally abusive, and he's not that, but you know, this is a lot for him to process. So if he's angry, I let him be angry. And we have gotten to a pretty good place now. We can sort of almost joke about it sometimes, I will say, and we do try to keep it lighthearted. I think that's helpful too. As early as we could, tried to make, he bought me a couple books on atheism as like a little olive branch. He was at the bookstore and saw one. He said, okay, I'll get this for her. And just to show that, you know, we're still able to see each other and acknowledge that difference. I will joke now and talk about, you know, with Ra's blessing, I will be able to do this, or in the name of Odin, I wish I could. And he can laugh at that. So we talk about other gods and how nobody believes in those gods anymore. Maybe our God is the same, or your God is the same. So yeah, it's a lot of open communication with breaks, a lot of respect, as much humor as you can manage to fit in there. This all feels so serious, you know, because we were raised that it was the utmost important thing. So I think trying to relax on that a little bit and realize, like, you know, life goes on, and to not put so much weight and pressure on what you believe theologically. I think about, there's got to be millions of Christians who never even ask themselves any of these questions, who just live life on autopilot, or, you know, they say they're a Christian, they don't think much about it. They go to church, they go on with the rest of their day. We are, I think, a special breed who puts so much importance and heaviness on it. And not everyone's living that way. Some people are just out there trying to make it, you know? So taking that step back and taking some of the pressure off helps relieve that too. But yeah, it's back and forth. It's still hard sometimes.
I think it helps a lot too, just knowing where we've been, where we have in our past been so intense, where we can put ourselves in their shoes and say, there was a day, you know, years ago now, but there was a day when I could have never imagined becoming an atheist. I would have said there's just no way. And even if you'd literally show me a video from the future, like this video is from 5 years from now or 10 years from now, just watch it. I would have just said, I don't believe it. There's no way that I'll become an atheist. That's just not possible. And to know that we were in those shoes, it helps, I think, for us to be able to say, I can see why you think that this is such a horrible thing. And it's interesting. One of the metaphors that was given to me by someone very close to me when I was deconverting, they said, look, it's like you have just gotten addicted to heroin, and you're trying to tell us this is so good and you should get addicted too. And like, we're not going to do it. It's like, this is a really bad thing. And it was like, that metaphor is an awful metaphor for deconverting Christianity, but that's how they saw it.
Mhm.
And I like when you see it that way, you're like, well, if that's the way you see it, I can see why you think this is a truly horrific thing
Yeah.
and a danger, even a danger to the family. But
Mhm.
it's
I
hard.
think, yeah, for my husband, I think his immediate fear, because there's that stereotype of atheists being either nihilistic or hedonistic, that I'm going to just start living for myself and being completely self-centered and it's all about me. Um, so I think for him to see with some time that I'm the same person, I still have the same values. I still actually value generosity and humility and living for others and being a good member of society, which involves caring about other people above myself sometimes. Um, I think as he saw that continue and that my values were, that's why another way I say I'm a Christian atheist, because I still have a very similar value system, most of which I got from Christianity. Now my reasoning for why I act that way is different, but it's still very similar behavior. Um, and so as I think as he saw that I didn't just start becoming some, yeah, hedonistic partying, floozy, he's like, okay, so I guess atheist, and he knew that. He had a roommate in college who was an atheist who really rattled him back then because he thought, gosh, this guy's got morals and he's a good person and he's an atheist. How does that work? So that was on his radar. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think with time and just being yourself and, again, giving each other a lot of grace and trying to believe the best in each other goes a long way.
It is a truth statement, though, that there are some people that really do find that their morality changes, obviously, not
Mhm.
just in terms of motivation, but even just in the sense of some of the basic questions. Like, I have just always assumed that heterosexuality and monogamy are the only
Mhm.
legitimate options. And to suddenly say, well, if there's no God and I'm not going to be judged for something, is
Mhm.
polyamory technically wrong? I mean, even if I don't want to do it myself, is it technically
Sure.
wrong for someone else? It's like you realize, no, whether it's your path or not, it's not technically wrong.
Right.
You obviously want to be doing things above board and where everyone's consenting, but it's like there's the right and wrong jumps ship, and so it's like I
Mhm.
can see why Christians do get concerned, like how even if
Mhm.
even if you won't do some of those things, the Christian might be thinking the fact that you're okay with other people doing them is,
Mhm.
it's very disconcerting, very disconcerting.
Yeah.
In terms of just continuing with some other final questions here to wrap us up, we started in your bio with talking about your family going camping and you being in nature. What role would you say at this point nature plays in sort of your spiritual and philosophical life? Like, did it become in some ways like a surrogate or a replacement for God, or like what part does it play at this point?
Yeah, I've always, as a Christian, I would have always said my true church was nature and outside. My family grew up camping. So as a little kid, I've always been a camper. And those are some of my fondest memories as a kid. Um, and so I've always felt a spiritual connection to the outdoors. And that has deepened a lot, even more so since leaving the faith. I would say, yeah, that nature has kind of come as close. If politics have replaced religion in my life, nature has replaced God to a degree. Um, because again, learning that path of evolution and seeing how connected we all are, you go back far enough backward on the evolutionary tree, and we're related to trees. There was that first organism that everything came from. Part of it branched off into plants, another branch went to animals. So to think that everything outside is my distant relative, to me, that's beautiful. You talked about poetry coming in a lot more. I feel way more poetic now when I'm outside because I think scientifically, truthfully, factually speaking, I am distantly connected and related to these creatures. We evolved from the same core. And so to me, that's very beautiful. It's also more motivating. I'm an even more fervent environmentalist than I was before. Thinking about these are my, my siblings, my cousins out there suffering from global changes and climate change. So yeah, nature has become a place that grounds me and calms me to be outside and also motivates me to get my ass in gear and try to help this planet because we're going through some massive pivotal changes as a whole right now. And so
Yeah.
yeah, nature has been very um yeah, both upsetting and where I find my peace too.
Mm, I
Mhm.
love it. But did you ever hear that song? I forget the words of it, but it's called "My Church," where the lady singing it talks about like driving down the highway with the radio blasting, like that's my church. And it's
Mhm.
funny how you do find that there's so many parts of life. Like I've got a friend that she lives out in Boulder, Colorado, and walking her dogs in the Rocky Mountains, like that's
Mhm.
her church now.
Mhm.
And it's interesting. You do kind of find your new sanctuary, whether it's just in your own head or out in nature. But yeah, I think realizing that nature is so critical to us. For a lot of us, it's so healing. And honestly,
Mhm.
I kind of cringe at how much time I spend, as I say that, how much time I spend in front of my computer at my desk. But it's part
Yeah.
of living in our modern world. You do have to work too.
Yeah.
If you were to write a follow-up book, it sounds like you're working on some stuff, but what would your next book be about? What topics are on your heart from this point in terms of relating, not separate from this, but like as a follow-up to what we've talked about?
Yeah. I have a couple ideas rolling around, one of which would be, I think it's been interesting to be non-religious now. I can look at all religions and see helpfulness to them, see helpful values or helpful perspectives. And I see them all as this human made attempt at, again, making meaning out of our lives. And when you look at a lot of the world's religions, many of them come down to love being critical, love being the number one thing, the biggest value. Jesus's commandments broke down into love God, love your neighbor. And a lot of the religions have similar core values of that being love. And so to ask, okay, what does that really look like, to love our neighbor day in and day out, to love the world? Because it's hard for me to love a far right conservative right now. It's hard for me to love the conspiracy theory QAnon folks. It's hard for me to love climate deniers. What does love look like from a secular point of view in our day-to-day world, and how can we do that in a way that doesn't abandon our values, or love with boundaries, and kind of trying to pick that apart a little bit, and use love as a guiding principle, from a secular worldview. But yeah, how that gets real tricky really fast. And so kind of exploring, that's one idea I have. I also have an idea to write a book about, again, if this life, this here and now earthly consciousness is my only experience I'll ever get, I want to make the most of it and be the healthiest version of myself I can be. And as a physical therapist, I am working right now in a nursing home. And so I'm working with people who are at the end of their stories. They're predominantly in their 80s and 90s. And so I'm thinking a lot more about death than I ever have before, because I'm surrounded by it. And um, it's interesting to see how different people approach the end of their life. And some folks there are bitter and angry about it and look back with a lot of regret and bitterness. And other people seem to be fairly at peace, and realize that their time is coming and are almost eager to die. Modern medicine prolongs it for so long now, past our natural end, what would have been. So I hear often that people are like, I don't know why I'm still here. I wish God would just take me. And so kind of analyzing, how do we live a good life, especially at the end? How do we approach the end with grace and from a place of peace? And so in medical, the medical community, we have the biopsychosocial model. So looking at that question, how do we live a good life from our biology, physical health, cognitively with our attitudes towards death and dying, and socially, psychologically with that community? Because again, the folks with good communities live the longest. So that's an idea I have, and how I would kind of outline a book on, how to live a good life. Because as far as I know, this is all we get.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
interesting thought. I was gonna ask you another question, but since you talked about that the way you did, I was thinking to add this one. With the afterlife that you used to, or that you grew up kind of thinking was real, did you have much trauma from thinking that that was now not going to be there? And like approaching the end of life topic, does it pain you to think about when you're gone and you're just like truly gone? You're not anywhere else. You're not coming back. You're not reincarnated. Most likely, you're not in an
Mhm.
afterlife. You're just back to dirt, back to dust. And does that hurt emotionally to think about the nothingness that's coming? That was obviously parallel to where we were before we were born, but we didn't know it then. Now we know it in this interim.
Right.
Does the nothingness scare you at all? Does it hurt to think about what you thought you had and lost?
I, even as a Christian, was a little bit scared of heaven. I thought it sounded boring. I was so worried about, do we really just have to sing hallelujah at the throne for millions of years? Like, ugh, singing in church was never my strong suit. And so I used to be worried that I would not like heaven. So to me, the idea of just lights out feels better, because I'm like, even an eternity of paradise would get old after a while. I really loved the show The Good Place and how they handled that. I don't know if you watch that.
Yeah.
I thought it was so good that they got to finally, they get to the end of the good place and everyone's a zombie. Eternity is too long. You cannot keep yourself going for eternity, even if you can fly and meet Abraham Lincoln and do all the things you want to do. It's too long. And having that door to be snuffed out completely gave meaning to eternity. Well, that is our current life. We have a door that's going to snuff us out at the end. That's what's giving this life meaning. And so to me, it actually just, I don't know. It's not that scary to think I'm done. Like you just mentioned, we didn't exist before we were born. I don't remember that. I assume it's a similar feeling. I won't know. Um, but also, and if I do, I've done a lot of reading on near death experiences, and that has brought me some comfort to think, okay, if there's something and we don't know how to explain those, people seem to have very universal experiences across the board who have near death experiences that are overwhelmingly positive. Seeing the light, an enveloping feeling of peace, palpable peace or love, seeing a loved one that's already passed. There's very common experiences that people have, regardless if they're religious or atheist, regardless what religion they are, regardless if they were committing suicide at the time of death. And that's why they're dying. So it doesn't seem to matter our choices in life, what got us there. There's folks that have had near-death experiences who were mafia hitmen and were what we would, think the bottom of the barrel morally, still had that feeling of peace and love. And so it might just be our brains firing in panic, but some of these people's experiences go on for a long period of time, well beyond brain activities. I don't know. It's that to me is another big mystery, and it's comforting in the fact that, okay, well, if there is something, seems to be universal across the board, a good thing. So we all join that light or that love, that energy, and that seems to be a positive experience. So if there's a thing, it's going to work out, I guess.
Yeah.
And
It's
if there's
interesting to
not,
think
there's
about.
not. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I tend to lean toward there's nothing, but yeah, it is interesting to think about the possibilities. In terms of just bringing us to a final conclusion, could you, number one, of course, just give us any final thoughts that are on your mind for anything that's part of your journey or your book that we didn't get to? But then also after that, could you give a final word to someone that's sort of at the beginning stages of some of what we talked about, where it's like they're questioning their faith. They know it's just a weird place to be. They're kind of uncertain where this journey is going to lead, but they also know that there could be a lot of pain through it, one way or the
Mhm.
other. So if you could share any final thoughts and then address the people that are going through the beginning stages of the deconstruction process.
Yeah, I think we did a good job. I appreciate your questions, going through my book and kind of a lot of the thought process that I went through there. The book is structured semi chronologically, more thematically of how I got to leaving. So it kind of echoes a lot of that deconstruction journey, and then wrestling with, okay, well, who am I now if I'm not a Christian, and dealing with all these philosophical questions. It's been really neat to release the book out into the world and have folks read it. Um, and really resonate and connect. That was my goal. I had felt so alone in that decision. I didn't know any other Christians that were all in and had completely left. So it felt very scary and lonely being there. I either knew, I had friends that weren't Christians, but they never really were. So they didn't know my grief. And I had a lot of progressive friends that had changed their views and made God into something new, but still believed in a version of God. And so I wrote the book really out of an act of reaching out for a connection. And so it's been fun to hear from people who have read it. And I've gotten a lot of really sweet messages over the last year now.
That's
And so
awesome.
that was my goal. So anybody who's there or thinking they're there and just feels alone and wants some comfort, that's why I wrote my book. So I hope that it brings that to some folks. Um, and yeah, I would, along those lines, kind of parting words, say, to the person who's still on the fence and isn't sure what to do with all of this, I do want to give that grace to say, like you said, nothing kind of matters. You don't have to even deconstruct. If it's so scary and paralyzing to you, you don't have to do it. You're allowed to cruise. You're allowed to just live your life, even if that means just going to church and zoning out every morning to keep the peace in your family. That's an acceptable choice. You don't owe anybody anything, even um, in your approach to the biggest questions in life. Because I don't think there's a report card. I don't think there's anybody grading us and judging us in the end. So if your faith isn't toxic and it's not hurting you and the people in your life, and it gives you some level of community and guidance to your life, great. Keep it up. Honestly, I would say that. At the same time, if you're like me and you have to know the truth and feel like you're being cognitively uh, learning and honest about it, don't be too afraid to take the plunge and know that it can work out. My life did not blow up. I almost feel bad saying this because I know so many people did. They lost a lot. They lost marriages. They lost relationships. That's not been my story. And so just to show an alternate example of how it can go, I'm still friends with all my friends, even my childhood friends that were my evangelical free church friends. I didn't have a ton left, with time. Many of those had faded anyway, but they're still in my life. My marriage is intact. My kids are sweet kids. I'm not raising amoral little monsters. um, so life can be good and even better. It's worked out. I honestly, it's funny. I talk a little bit in the book about the irony that when I got to that point, I had been at kind of a bit of a rock bottom, being laid off. It was the pandemic. Everything was going to hell in a handbasket, and my life got a million times better across the board. My husband's job picked up, financially stable. We found a new nanny who was awesome. I got a new job that's better. Um, Things really worked out. So I like to joke, if God is out there, they seem to be blessing me for making this choice. So yeah, there are folks that deconstruct and things even improve and don't get a whole of a lot worse. So
Remind
just
me
to
of,
give,
Ricky Gervais,
oh
the
yeah,
comedian. Remind
yeah.
me of how he would end his Golden Globes posting by saying, I just want to thank you all for showing up. And by the way, also, thank God I'm an atheist. It's like,
Exactly.
you want to be grateful for something, but
Yep. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, yeah, that's a good closing line. Thank God I'm an atheist, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
absolutely. Well, everyone, please do, again, check out Sarah's work. I'll have the link for her YouTube channel, for her Instagram, for her blog, all that stuff. I'll have the links for you to get her book. But please do check it out, and please pick up her book. It's really cool. I've gone through her book. Amazing stuff, amazing content. Honestly, I'm not just saying this. Like I'm intending to go back through it. I feel like
Mm,
it was one of those books where when I read through it, I thought I need to kind of go back a second time because you can just sense that there's more layers to it.
mm,
And I'm a note taker. I'm an avid note taker, um,
mhm,
to a fault. And so I'm like, there's a lot of things to glean there, and a lot of things where I just thought, like, there's little spots where you kind of want to read, and then you kind of want to stop and just like dwell on that and like expand on
mhm.
that, and before you go on. And so, really good book. I highly recommend
Thank
it.
you.
But I'll just wrap up by saying we've been speaking with Sarah Henn Hayward. Sarah, so good to hear your story. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a great day.